The Americans, Chapter 22, The Great Depression Begins. Section 1, The Nation's Sick Economy. Gordon Parks, the well-known photographer, author, and filmmaker, was a 16-year-old high school student in the fall of 1929. He supported himself as a busboy at the exclusive Minnesota Club, where prosperous club members spoke confidently about the economy. Parks, too, looked forward to a bright future. Then came the stock market crash of October 1929. In his autobiography, Parks recalled his feelings at the time. A personal voice, Gordon Parks.
I couldn't imagine such financial disaster touching my small world. It surely concerned only the rich. But by the first week of November, I was without a job. All that next week, I searched for any kind of work that would prevent my leaving school. Again, it was, we're firing, not hiring. I went to school and cleaned out my locker, knowing it was impossible to stay on. A piercing chill was in the air as I walked back to the rooming house. The crash of 1929 and the depression that followed dealt a crushing blow to the hopes and dreams of millions of Americans. The high-flying prosperity of the 1920s was over. Hard times had begun. Part 1. Economic troubles on the horizon. As the 1920s advanced, serious problems threatened economic prosperity. Though some Americans became wealthy, many more could not earn a decent living. Important industries struggled, and farmers grew more crops and raised more livestock than they could sell at a profit. Both consumers and farmers were steadily going deeper into debt. As the decade drew to a close, these slippages in the economy signaled the end of an era. Industries in trouble. The superficial prosperity of the late 1920s shrouded weaknesses that would signal the onset of the Great Depression. Key basic industries such as railroads, textiles, and steel had barely made a profit. Railroads lost business to new forms of transportation, trucks, buses, and private automobiles, for instance. Mining and lumbering, which had expanded during wartime, were no longer in high demand. Coal mining was especially hard hit, in part due to stiff competition from new forms of energy, including hydroelectric power, fuel oil, and natural gas. By the early 1930s, these sources supplied more than half of the energy that had once come from coal. Even the boom industries of the 1920s, automobiles, construction, and consumer goods, weakened. One important economic indicator that declined during this time was housing starts, the number of new dwellings being built. When housing starts fall, so do jobs in many related industries, such as furniture manufacturing and lumbering. Farmers need a lift. Perhaps agriculture suffered the most. During World War I, prices rose and international demand for crops such as wheat and corn soared. Farmers had planted more and taken out loans for land and equipment. However, demand fell after the war, and crop prices declined by 40% or more. Farmers boosted production in the hopes of selling more crops, but this only depressed prices further. Between 1919 and 1921, annual farm income declined from $10 billion to just over $4 billion. Farmers who had gone into debt had difficulty in paying off their loans. Many lost their farms when banks foreclosed and seized the property as payment for the debt. As farmers began to default on their loans, many rural banks began to fail. Auctions were held to recoup some of the bank's losses. Congress tried to help out farmers with a piece of legislation called the McNary-Haugen Bill. This called for federal price supports for key products such as wheat, corn, cotton, and tobacco. The government would buy surplus crops at guaranteed prices and sell them on the world market. President Coolidge vetoed the bill twice. He commented, "Farmers have never made money. I don't believe we can do much about it. Consumers have less money to spend. As farmers' incomes fell, they bought fewer goods and services, but the problem was larger. By the late 1920s, Americans were buying less, mainly because of rising prices, stagnant wages, unbalanced distribution of income, and overbuying on credit in the preceding years. Production had also expanded much faster than wages, resulting in an ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor. Living on credit. Although many Americans appeared to be prosperous during the 1920s, in fact, they were living beyond their means. They often bought goods on credit, an arrangement in which consumers agreed to buy now and pay later for purchases. This was often in the form of an installment plan, usually in monthly payments, that included interest charges. By making credit easily available, businesses encouraged Americans to pile up large consumer debt. Many people then had trouble paying off their growing debts. Faced with debt, consumers cut back on spending. Uneven distribution of income. During the 1920s, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Between 1920 and 1929, the income of the wealthiest 1% of the population rose by 75%, compared with a 9% increase for Americans as a whole. More than 70% of the nation's families earned less than $2,500 a year, then considered the minimum amount needed for a decent standard of living. Even families earning twice that much could not afford many of the household products that manufacturers produced. Economists estimate that the average man or woman bought a new outfit of clothing only once a year. Scarcely half of the homes in many cities had electric lights or furnace for heat. Only one city home in 10 had an electric refrigerator. This unequal distribution of income meant that most Americans could not participate fully in the economic advances of the 1920s. Many people did not have the money to purchase the flood of goods that factories produced. The prosperity of the era rested on a fragile foundation. Part 2. Hoover takes the nation. Although economic disaster was around the corner, the election of 1928 took place in a mood of apparent national prosperity. This election pitted Republican candidate Herbert Hoover against Democrat Alfred E. Smith. The election of 1928. Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge, was a mining engineer from Iowa who had never run for public office. Smith was a career politician who had served 4 terms as governor of New York. He was personable and enjoyed being in the limelight, unlike the quiet and reserved Hoover. Still, Hoover had one major advantage. He could point to years of prosperity under Republican administrations since 1920. Many Americans believed him when he declared, "We in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before." It was an overwhelming victory for Hoover. The message was clear. Most Americans were happy with Republican leadership. Dreams of riches in the stock market. By 1929, some economists had warned of weaknesses in the economy, but most Americans maintained the utmost confidence in the nation's economic health. In increasing numbers, those who could afford to invest in the stock market. The stock market had become the most visible symbol of a prosperous American economy. Then, as now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was the most widely used barometer of the stock market's health. The Dow is a measure based on the stock prices of 30 representative large firms trading on the New York Stock Exchange. Through most of the 1920s, stock prices rose steadily. The Dow had reached a high of 381 points, nearly 300 points higher than it had been 5 years earlier. Eager to take advantage of this bull market, a period of rising stock prices, Americans rushed to buy stocks and bonds. One observer wrote, "It seemed as if all economic law had been suspended, and a new era opened up in which success and prosperity could be had without knowledge or industry."
By 1929, about 4 million Americans, or 3% of the nation's population, owned stocks. Many of these investors were already wealthy, but others were average Americans who hoped to strike it rich. However, the seeds of trouble were taking root. People were engaging in speculation. That is, they bought stocks and bonds on the chance of a quick profit while ignoring the risks. Many began buying on margin, paying a small percentage of a stock's price as a down payment and borrowing the rest. With easy money available to investors, the unrestrained buying and selling fueled the market's upward spiral. The government did little to discourage such buying or to regulate the market. In reality, these rising prices did not reflect companies' worth. Worse, if the value of stocks declined, people who had bought on margin had no way to pay off the loans. Part 3. The stock market crashes. In early September 1929, stock prices peaked and then fell. Confidence in the market started to waver, and some investors quickly sold their stocks and pulled out. On October 24th, the market took a plunge. Panicked investors unloaded their shares. But the worst was yet to come. Black Tuesday. On October 29th, now known as Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out of the market and the nation's confidence. Shareholders frantically tried to sell before prices plunged even lower. The numbers of shares dumped that day was a record 16.4 million. Additional millions of shares could not find buyers. People who had bought stocks on credit were stuck with huge debts as the prices plummeted, while others lost much of their savings. By mid-November, investors had lost about $30 billion, an amount equal to how much America spent in World War I. The stock market bubble had finally burst. One eyewitness to these events, Frederick Lewis Allen, described the resulting situation. A personal voice, Frederick Lewis Allen. The big bull market was dead. Billions of dollars worth of profits and paper profits had disappeared. The grocer, the window cleaner, the seamstress had lost their capital, savings. In every town, there were families which had suddenly dropped from showy affluence into debt. With the big bull market gone and prosperity going, Americans were soon to find themselves living in an altered world, which called for new adjustments, new ideas, new habits of thought, and a new order of values. Part 4. Financial collapse. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, the period from 1929 to 1940, in which the economy plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed. The crash alone did not cause the Great Depression, but it hastened the collapse of the economy and made the depression more severe. Bank and business failures. After the crash, many people panicked and withdrew their money from banks. But some couldn't get their money because the banks had invested it in the stock market. In 1929, 600 banks closed. By 1933, 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks had failed. Because the government did not protect or insure bank accounts, millions of people lost their savings accounts. The Great Depression hit other businesses too. Between 1929 and 1932, the gross national product, the nation's total output of goods and services, was cut nearly in half, from $104 billion to $59 billion. Approximately 90,000 businesses went bankrupt. Among these failed enterprises were once prosperous automobile and railroad companies. As the economy plunged into a tailspin, millions of workers lost their jobs. Unemployment leaped from 3%, 1.6 million workers in 1929, to 25%, 13 million workers in 1933. 1 out of every 4 workers was out of a job. Those who kept their jobs faced pay cuts and reduced hours. Not everyone fared so badly, of course. Before the crash, some speculators had sold off their stocks and made money. Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of future President John F. Kennedy, was one who did. Most, however, were not so lucky or shrewd. Worldwide shock waves. The United States was not the only country gripped by the Great Depression. Much of Europe, for example, had suffered throughout the 1920s. European countries trying to recover from the ravages of World War I faced high war debts. In addition, Germany had to pay war reparations, payments to compensate the Allies for the damages Germany had caused. The Great Depression compounded these problems by limiting America's ability to import European goods. This made it difficult to sell American farm products and manufactured goods abroad. In 1930, Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which established the highest protective tariff in the United States history. It was designed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition, yet it had the opposite effect. By reducing the flow of goods into the United States, the tariff prevented other countries from earning American currency to buy American goods. The tariff made unemployment worse in industries that could no longer export goods to Europe. Many countries retaliated by raising their own tariffs. Within a few years, world trade had fallen more than 40%. Causes of the Great Depression. Although historians and economists differ on the main causes of the Great Depression, most cite a common set of factors, among them tariffs and war debt policies that cut down the foreign market for American goods, a crisis in the farm sector, the availability of easy credit, an unequal distribution of income. These factors led to falling demand for consumer goods, even as newly mechanized factories produced more products. The federal government contributed to this crisis by keeping interest rates low, thereby allowing companies and individuals to borrow easily and build up large debts. Some of this borrowed money was used to buy the stocks that later led to the crash. At first, people found it hard to believe that economic disaster had struck. In November 1929, President Hoover encouraged Americans to remain confident about the economy. Yet, the most severe depression in American history was well on its way.